Welcome to CNE, everybody.
Hello.
My name is Andrew Robinson. I am the program manager here at the Center for Nonprofit Excellence. Really excited today to be offering, as many of the things we're doing these days, a brand new program. Hopefully, helping you all with the challenges that you're facing right now around operations, human resources, thinking about insurance, as we make this this move, or at least begin to think about this move of getting back into some of the spaces we haven't been in for a while, or having more people in those spaces or more clients in those spaces, and doing that probably very differently than we have in the past for a lot of us. So I think this is the beginning of a conversation. I hope that you'll take the opportunity to ask questions of our speakers during this time and follow up with them if necessary. And always feel free to reach out to CNE, to me, or to our senior membership manager, Katie Davis, if you have any specific questions about these things, because we're always happy to try and find you the best answer we can. And also, if we start hearing themes and we need to do some other kind of program like this, we want to be able to do that. A couple of logistical pieces just before we get started. One is welcome, but the other ones are, sorry, I'm fighting some logistical issues.
Escape.
Sorry, give me 1 second. There we go. Okay. Apologies. Okay, so some Zoom guidelines as we get started. One is, if you haven't done so already, you can open up both your participants window and your chat window. So you'll find those in the menu at the bottom of your screen. The participants window lets you see who else is in the room, which is great, and lets us see who's here. So if you haven't already done so, if you could change your name so that it reflects your real name, so that we know who's here. One, so I can keep track of who comes to our trainings. It's something we like to do at the organization. But also so you can see who else from the community is here, because a lot of you do actually know each other, and it's a nice chance to connect. And you should be able to use the chat function through privately or in the large group to connect with one another throughout the training. The other thing you can use the chat for is to ask any questions along the way. So we're going to hear from 3 speakers, and at the end of that, we're going to have a large Q&A session. But if there's any questions that you have in your head and you want to get out and get them into the chat, I will take note of them. If you have a question about clarity, if a presenter said something you just don't understand, please throw that in the chat as soon as possible, and I'll interrupt them and make sure that we get that cleared up before we get too far beyond that point. And the last thing I'll mention is that we will be, I'll be circulating an evaluation form towards the end so we can get some feedback from you all about how this session went, and then also about other trainings that will be of use to you in the future. So I want to get started, but one thing that we talked about as a team today at CNE, given what's going on in the world around us and over the course of the weekend in particular, I wanted to take a moment to just have a moment of silence. And so I'm just going to ask for folks to observe a moment of silence for the victims of racist violence and for those who have lost their lives in the struggle for that justice. So please take a moment with me. Thanks for that. So diving into the reason that we're all here today, thinking about reentry and reopening in this other big piece that's going on right now, the global pandemic that we're situated in, and thinking about how in Virginia and in our communities and in our organizations, how to move forward with that. So we have with us today 3 presenters. We're going to hear from them in order, and then again have some time for questions at the end. So we have with us today Kathleen Quinn. Kathleen has years of experience in operations, largely in the healthcare industry. She also brings a substantial amount of nonprofit experience, both as a volunteer and as a board member in local organizations that I'm sure you recognize. So excited to have her here today to talk about the operations piece. We also have Jennifer Archer. Jennifer is with Inspiring HR, which is a firm that is actually a remote firm that works across the country, but has a strong presence and a base in Richmond. We've done a lot of work with them over the last year or so. Excited to have another representative from Inspiring here today, and welcome to Jennifer. And then our third speaker is Jay Stelford. Jay is with Bankers Insurance and works specifically in property and casualty insurance. We've worked with Bankers for a while. I've enjoyed a strong relationship with them as a corporate sponsor of CNE. Really excited to have Bankers back in the house and to have Jay with us today. And I'm going to hand things over to Kathleen to get us started.
Great. All right. Well, thank you so much, Andrew. And thanks to everybody for taking the time to be here today. First, I just wanted to start by acknowledging that reopening is both exciting and very scary for most of us. We want to get back to serving our clients with the passion and the vigor that we bring to this work, but we also are acutely aware of the anxiety it creates for our employees, for our volunteers, and for our clients. So just kind of hold those two separate things in your head and your heart as you go through this work. I think it's important to also say that if you think back to mid-March, we were hearing about this virus thing kind of off in the distance in China while we were going about our completely normal operations, say on March 10th. And then suddenly we see some states start to close, shelter in place, and it seemed like it happened like that. We went from completely normal operations to no one's coming into the office. We've got to figure out how to telecommute and serve our clients in a very different way. And that was challenging. I think this reopening will be similar to that. We get a little bit more of a runway to plan, which is advantageous. But we also know that if we do get a second wave of the virus, we're going to have to pivot again. So I think it's really important to stay flexible and to plan for the different scenarios as best you can as you go through this. Virginia is on the path forward, still in phase 1. Andrew, if you could advance for me, that'd be great. The 3 phases that the governor has identified. He did say on, I think it was Friday, that he was likely, or maybe it was Wednesday, excuse me, last Wednesday, he was likely going to go to phase 2 on Friday, June 5th. Phase 2 essentially looks a lot like phase 1 to me, except for the gatherings of people can be a little larger, so up to 50 individuals as opposed to 10, but continuing to wear face masks and social distance and those kinds of things. So it doesn't look all that different. And I think there will be some capacity changes, but I don't know what those will be. Currently, I think restaurants can have people, 25% of their capacity, that kind of thing. I'm guessing that phase 2, we'll learn more about that this Wednesday. But some of those, I think, restrictions will be eased, but probably not eliminated until phase 3. So as we go through this work, I want you to think about this in kind of 3 buckets. Andrew, if you could advance for me, I'm not really sure. Yeah, there we go. I want you to think about people, place, and process. Everything we'll talk about today in my section will fall into one of the 3 buckets. So people. First, think about who your people are. Certainly it's your staff, but also your customers or your clients, your suppliers. Are they back in business? Are they going to be able to provide you with what you need for your operations? Your volunteers. Lots of volunteers are in the senior category. So are they going to both feel safe and be safe coming back to regular operations, or will you need to make different accommodations for them? And even delivery folks coming in and out of your office. Maybe you want to have deliveries done a different way or something. So kind of just thinking about all the people that come into your workspace. In terms of place, now that we've been inside trying to do our jobs in our pajamas, it's time to put on pants with a waistband and get back to work. As leaders, you are acutely aware of the physical space that you have. You think about it a lot. You think about it in terms of paying rent and furniture and all those things. But now you got to think about it in terms of, is this a safe space to be inviting people back into? Am I causing them any undue risk by inviting them back in? I think it's helpful to think about, when you think about your space and what you need to do, is, picture how the daily activities happen. Are people sitting or standing or moving between offices or workstations? Are clients coming in and out? Do they use more than one exit or entrance? Are they bringing things with them? Do they sit? Are there a lot of surfaces that they touch? I think just kind of picture pre-COVID, picture how your office worked, and think about kind of the risk points that you might have. Everybody now knows about this 6-foot bubble that we need to keep around each other. That's going to be challenging. So you may need to do things, very differently. You may need to install physical barriers. Certainly we see at a lot of retail stores that they put tape on the floor to mark off the 6 feet. A lot of places are doing directional signs, this aisle is one way, that aisle is a different way, to kind of trying to keep people moving in the same direction so you don't have people passing in front of each other as often. Certainly in terms of place, we know that cleaning and disinfecting are going to be much more than emptying the trash, cleaning the vacuum and vacuuming. So have you met with your cleaning service to understand what their new processes are? Do they even have new processes? Have you anticipated an increase in that expense? Because I think it's fair to say that cleaning will be a more frequent issue for most offices, and it will be more expensive, both for the daily clean as in addition to kind of the deep clean that you probably want to do just before you open. Think about masks and hand washing. Are you providing masks for your staff, or are you expecting them to BYOM? How about your clients or your volunteers? Do you have plenty of soap and water on hand, and an ability to refill it the day if needed? Now this sounds really dumb, but I bet there's a lot of us who have a soap dispenser in the employee bathroom or the public bathroom, and you don't know how to open it. There's those little magical keys and all that. So just kind of be thinking through those very kind of mundane but important details. Are there signs in your bathroom to hand wash for 20 seconds? That's kind of the golden rule, 20 seconds. So those are some of the place issues. We'll talk more into more of some of those. In terms of processes, think about how your work gets done. This unchoreographed dance that most of us have between coworkers, between employees and clients, between volunteers and staff. How do all those dances happen? How do you do that now with a 6-foot bubble around everybody? That becomes sort of tricky. Maybe you can continue to operate with some telecommuting to keep the volume of people down in the office. If you regularly have staff meetings or team meetings, you have a new plan to accomplish that important communication while keeping everybody safe. You may need to install physical barriers if you're not confident you can maintain 6 feet of distance. Are you planning on screening workers when they come into the office? Many workplaces are performing temperature checks. I want you to think about the temperature checks though. My opinion is that they offer very little value. And the reason is the majority of people who test positive for COVID do not have symptoms. And if you have a room full of people who you've checked their temperature and nobody has a fever, then you may give people this false sense of security that everybody is fine, and they may let down their guard. And that could be risky for you. So just kind of think about that temperature thing. maybe it's better to do some screening questions, like if do you have a cough? Do you have any of these symptoms? Shortness of breath, aches? Have you lost your sense of smell or taste? Sore throats? Think about those kinds of things. They might be better. You might be better to screen on questions than you are on temperature checks. Okay. Hygiene etiquette. So soap and water remains the gold standard. Now, recently, last week, there was some new information that came out that said that the risk from surface contamination was less than previously thought. So I thought that was great news. They said that essentially to catch COVID from a surface, there would need to be a lot of virus on the surface. Like somebody would have just had to come and like sneeze on your countertop. And then you would come along and put your hand right where they sneezed. And then you would have to touch your eyes, your nose, or your mouth. That's how it would get transmitted from a surface. So you might remember back in late March when we were just in the beginning of this pandemic, and we were all probably disinfecting our cereal boxes when we got home from the grocery store. So the information about the surfaces has gotten better. The information about transmission from person to person is still very scary, which is why the 6-foot standard is still in place. So surfaces are less risky than we originally thought. And again, good news came out last week about that, but they're still not without risk. So hand washing is still important. And again, soap and water for 20 seconds is the gold standard. If you don't have soap and water readily available, then alcohol-based hand sanitizer is what you need. There's a lot of hand sanitizer without alcohol in it, and that really won't help you for this virus. It needs to have 60% or more of alcohol in it. Masks are required currently, but even when they're no longer required, I think signage around respiratory etiquette is useful. Things like cover your coughs and sneezes, avoid touching your face, and providing tissues in your office. And think about the trash cans. This seems very minor, I know, but you don't want somebody blowing their nose and then having to touch a trash can lid to toss it out. So just think about all those kind of touch surfaces. So physical distancing, that I think is going to be a big challenge for most people. We all don't have palaces where we're stationed. So I think Jennifer's going to go into more detail on some HR strategies to create distance. But I would also advise you to engage your staff as to how to best accomplish this. Maybe they could do some, shared shifts or split shifts. And don't forget about break rooms and elevators and kitchens and places where people kind of normally congregate. So it's going to be important. Next one for me, Andrew. You also probably have more shared surfaces than you would want to ever think about. So you might have shared computers. Most of us have shared printers or copiers. Most of the phones are shared. If you share pens with customers, think about that. Probably don't want to be doing that. You might be in an organization where you share car rides back and forth to places. And it's hard to say, unless you've got a really wide car, it's hard to be 6 feet apart. So kind of think about minimizing or eliminating to the extent that you can that. Counters, of course. Think about your coffee or water station. Is that, lots of hands around there? You might have a lot of books and manuals that are shared that you really don't want to replicate. So maybe you just put a plastic cover over the cover of them to be able to make them, cleanable, if you will. And of course, bathrooms and furniture. It's probably impossible to eliminate sharing, but it probably is possible to minimize the sharing. You also might want to have as you're opening up, maybe have a dress rehearsal. Get some staff in and have somebody just watch a dress rehearsal of how you're operating, and they can maybe pick up things that are maybe need to be tweaked, some workflows that maybe need to be tweaked because they're a little bit too risky between colleagues or between staff and clients. So just think about that. Cleaning and disinfecting. So it's important to get to know your cleaning procedures in a way that you probably never wanted to do. Reviewing the CDC guidelines and understanding what guidelines apply to you is really important. I've put on this slide some examples of common cleaning products and the different times that you're supposed to leave the surface wet with that particular product before you wipe it dry. So if your cleaning crew is coming along with a chloric bleach solution, spray, 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 wipe, 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 that's not going to help you. It needs to sit there for 5 minutes. So I want you to go over the cleaning procedures with the cleaning crew in pretty great detail, you know, and print out those CDC guidelines. They have them for different kind of offices and different kinds of settings. But, you know, you can see here that that the devil's in the detail, if you will. Also, know that your staff will be cleaning more than before. I think about this as something like the gym, where they have professional cleaning crew, but it's my responsibility to clean the machine once I get on it and off of it. That's kind of how we have to think about this now with our staff. So we all become sort of cleaners as we go through our day to keep each other safe, ourselves safe, and our clients safe. Supplies. So the PPE, I don't know if any of your organizations would need face shields or goggles, but most will need masks and gloves. And be thinking about which ones you're going to supply, and you're going to have some on hand for people who forget their mask. But you'll need to have at least some on hand, and depending on how much traffic you have in your building, you may need to have a whole lot on hand. And the recommendation is that you have 30 days of supplies on hand in advance. Okay. So I want to close my part of this training by saying, stay humble and keep learning. This is such a dynamic situation. We all deserve to feel safe at work. We're all learning every day. Even the experts are learning new things. So what's state of the art today might be very outdated tomorrow. Staff will be very anxious. Know that you have tremendous influence in creating a tone of calmness and confidence in them. Clients and customers will judge you on 3 things. They will watch to see how well your staff is trained and if their behaviors have changed. They will look at your physical facility to see if they see risks that you didn't see. Do things look differently? And they will be watching very closely to see if your work process changed with them. So as an example, I drive for Meals on Wheels, and when we start delivering again in 2 weeks, a week and a half now, we're going to do the drop off at the door, knock on the door, and then step away behind, 6 feet. We would normally knock and then usually we go in and talk to the client. So that's going to be very different. If we just went right back to what we were doing before, I think that would make clients very uncomfortable. So the clients will be watching what we're doing. They're going to be watching your staff. They're going to look at your facility and say, have they made adaptations? And they're going to be watching for how you interact with them to say, are they keeping me safe, me the client safe? Also, know that things will come up that you didn't think of. Maybe even things that you probably should have thought of. That's okay. Don't beat yourself up. Just always be willing to adapt and be flexible. Hindsight is 20/20. Just keep your focus on what's in front of you and not what's behind you. You will make mistakes. That's a given. But just keep doing the best you're gonna, that you can. Have a plan A, a plan B, and a plan C, because you'll need all 3. The fact that you're taking the time today to be on this call tells me that you're already thinking about the readiness and what you need to do. And so given that, I just know you're all going to do a fantastic job. So thanks very much for your time and attention. I'm going to toss this over to Jennifer, who's going to go into some more great detail on HR. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathleen.
Thanks, Kathleen. Do you want me to just take it from here?
For sure.
Okay, great. Well, I appreciate being invited today and having a chance to speak with you all. I'm Jennifer Archer, and I work with Inspiring HR. We are an HR consulting firm that, as Andrew said earlier, we're based in Virginia, primarily in the Richmond area, but we're all over the country in 7 different states, I think, right now. And so we're going to talk today about not only, what can you be thinking of, what can you prepare for, but really it's important, as Kathleen said, to have a plan. It's going to change, it's going to evolve over time, but to have a plan and that communicate that plan as appropriate to your team, your clients, anyone that you interact with. So if you can go ahead and advance to the next slide, Andrew. First, we're going to talk a little bit about policies and practices that you should be putting in place for when you are reopening your workspace. Is there a restructuring you're going to need to do? If you've been shut down completely instead of teleworking, are you actually going to be rehiring employees, and what does that look like? Are there implications for the Family First Coronavirus Response Act that are going to affect your employees? Because if you have been shut down and now you're reopening, you may not really have gotten familiar with that if you shut down before it went into effect. It will continue to be into effect until December 31st, so you may need to make that available to your employees. And then just different things to think about, what ifs, tips and insight, things that our clients are asking us, or that we're asking each other as we try and navigate these unprecedented times. So the first thing to talk about is, what are your policies going to be? And Andrew, if you can advance the slide. So first and foremost, you want to make sure you've got the safety considerations, and Kathleen did a great job of speaking to a lot of the physical aspects of the facility and even the processes that you can modify. Privacy, she talked about temperature taking. Privacy becomes a big issue with that. But being able to be flexible and accommodate when you do have someone who is concerned that maybe they have been exposed. Do they have to stay home? What's going to be your policy for that? Making sure that your paid leave policy is adjusted to reflect the regulatory requirements and your actual business needs. Are you going to have your attendance policy be relaxed because you want to encourage sick employees to stay home? So if you've got an attendance policy that says you have this many absences and you get corrective action, well, you might need to adjust that because you're really going to want people to stay at home if they are experiencing any COVID symptoms until they can seek diagnosis. There's also legal implications there as well. What are your time off request procedures going to be? Are you going to need to clarify them? If you have paper request forms, obviously we don't want to be doing anything on paper now that we don't have to. We want that to be more of an electronic request. Flexible scheduling options, whether you're doing compressed work weeks so that, if you do longer days, fewer people, and kind of shifting back and forth who's going to be in the office and who's not going to be in the office. Flexible start and stop times. Meal and rest break policies. If you have an eating area, a kitchen, a break room, obviously you don't want everyone in the break room at the same time. You need to think about adjusting those. Are you even going to allow access to the kitchen if you have such a place, or are you going to declare that off limits during this process? If you are going to allow access to it, as Kathleen said, what are the procedures for getting it ready for the next person when you're done? Are you going to have each person sanitize the refrigerator, the coffee maker after they've done what they're going to do, the microwave? All that needs to be considered. Do you need to update your travel policies? If you're defining essential travel versus non-essential travel, what is that? Who decides that? Who decides when it is essential to travel and who doesn't get to decide that? And I think a lot of organizations, a lot of agencies have been able to do telecommuting. And are you going to continue that in all circumstances? In some circumstances, who can continue to request to work from home and who's going to have to report to the office? Information technology procedures, that's a huge question mark. We're really encouraging our clients to make sure that if you have employees that are working from home, they're not, as the Starbucks happens to reopen, and they want to go sit outside and work at the Starbucks using Starbucks network, are they accessing company or agency information there? Is that protected? Are you using a VPN, a virtual privacy network, so that you aren't potentially sharing your information broadly across an unsecured network? And then communicating those policies is very important. You can have a great policy, but if you haven't trained your employees, your volunteers, anyone that you're interacting with, your stakeholders, your board, they're not going to know. So you've got to communicate that. We really recommend documenting that communication so that if someone says, I don't feel comfortable coming back to the office, you can show that you've already communicated all the safety procedures that you put into place so that they will be safe and that they can feel comfortable returning. So if there's any training that needs to be conducted around your cleaning procedures, how are you going to do that? you can't get everyone in the office conference room to do the training. So are you going to do that via Zoom? Is it going to be strictly written communication? How are you going to conduct training? And that's going to be on a go forward basis. Probably most importantly is making sure your exposure response communications are documented and ready to go. If someone calls your office and says, hi, I'm a client, I was in there last week and I've just tested positive for COVID, do you have a policy in place that says these are the steps that you take at that time? And even think about media communications. If you get contacted by the media about how are you handling the situation, what are you doing to keep your employees and your stakeholders safe, have someone designated within the agency to respond to those types of questions if you haven't already done that. So I know that's a lot. That's a lot to think about. So there's a lot of great resources that are out there. The Forward Virginia guidelines apply to all businesses. There's some that are best practices, and then there are some that are mandated. If you're going to operate, you have to follow these. So there's been a lot of question about who has the right to say you're required to do X or you're required to do Y. The CDC guidelines are just that. They're simply guidelines. But OSHA requires that employers provide a workplace that is safe from recognized threats. And it's pretty readily apparent that COVID is a recognized threat. So while CDC guidelines may just be guidelines, it's reasonable to say following CDC guidelines is actually required in order to keep your workplace safe from a recognized threat under OSHA. So I'm not a lawyer, I don't play one on TV, but it is important that you document the steps you're taking to keep your folks safe. Because if someone were to be exposed, again, you are under OSHA guidelines required to provide that safe workplace. So something to think about. Okay, so policies, enough about the policies. Let's move on. Workplace restructuring. I think Kathleen did a great job talking about sanitizing requirements and cleaning. The only thing I would add is making sure that your employees do have sufficient break time to be able to do that, you know, the hygiene, the hand washing, and so forth. Self-screening, Kathleen touched on that, and I definitely hear her concern. There are more than just a temperature, but we're actually recommending that you provide your employees a self-screening log so that they can, at home, before they even enter the workplace each day, check their temperature, assess themselves against the COVID symptoms, and document that themselves. And that way, their confidentiality and privacy is maintained. They're not giving it to anyone, but you are able to document, because a lot of times temperatures, it's 100.4 is the temperature under CDC guidelines that is triggering a concern that there's a potential COVID exposure. People get temperatures for lots of reasons. People have different temperatures on a day-to-day basis. Like, my normal temperature is 97.6, not 98.6. So if I have a temperature of 99.9, I'm not feeling good. So that way the employees will kind of get to know what's their baseline temperature if they're recording it every day. And if they see a spike, even if it's not to the 100.4 level, they may say, maybe I better work from home today because I don't want to bring anything into the office, whether it's COVID or anything else. So that's something to think about as far as employee self-screening. Signs. Kathleen touched on this. It's really important that you have signage into your office, reminding people if you are open to the community, you want to have a sign that's on your door that says, do you have any of these symptoms? If so, please don't enter. Call us, we'll try and help you remotely, but you don't want people to just not even think about it and walk in your door. If you're requiring people to have masks entering into your office space or your workplace, you're going to want that on the door as well. Again, assuming you're open to people walking in. And if you don't want people walking in, put a sign on the door that says, we're only seeing people during this time by appointment only. So please contact us at XYZ number so that you can arrange for that communication in a way other than a walk-in. Social distancing, I think we all are very familiar with that 6-foot thing. I'm like, why are we even calling it social distancing anymore? It's physical distancing is what we're talking about. We need to physically stay separate from each other. So making sure that everybody knows what are your policies on that. If you are having in-person meetings, how can you do that safely? If you don't have a large office space, can you do meetings in parks? Can you do meetings I'm not even sure if libraries are reopening yet, but when they do, can you get their space? So again, you've got a larger space in which to hold the meeting so that you can have that face-to-face interaction, but still maintain those physical separations. And then scheduling options, we've talked about that a little bit, whether you're doing half days or mixed remote, mixed in office. But it's going to be important not just to communicate what your requirements are once, but on an ongoing basis. And, you know, coaching people, if you see them walking the hallways and their mask is hanging off one of their ears, just a quick reminder, hey, we got to keep our masks on our faces when we're not in our own personal space. You know, reminding them, coaching them, and monitoring them on an ongoing basis to make sure that they're adhering to the provisions that have been put in place to keep everyone safe, because we all know that the first day, everybody's going to be like, oh yeah, I've got my mask on and I'm staying 6 feet away. But as we get more comfortable being in the same space together, people are going to get relaxed and they're going to start forgetting, skipping, getting, you know, and that's when problems can occur. So staying on top of that and monitoring is going to be important. Okay, next slide, please. So the next slide is talking about rehiring and hiring. I don't know if anyone that's with us today has had to lay off or furlough, however you refer to it, your workplace or employees within your workplace. But if so, then you're going to need to determine, how are you bringing them back? How long have they been out? Are they going to have to re-enroll in benefits? Are they going to have to reapply for their position within the organization? Have you had to make any pay changes? If so, we recommend anything that's different, even if it's just, you know, come back to work at your current, you know, your prior pay, prior schedule, all the same things are in place. You do that in writing so that it's clear they have been asked to return to work on XYZ date, and they knew what the provisions were, and they knew what the procedures were that you're keeping them safe. That becomes very important if you have any employees who are saying, no, I'm making more money getting unemployment than I would be if I came back to work. So, and we'll talk about that on the next slide. Do you need to reorient people to your workplace? Do you have new hire reports that you're going to have to fill out and submit to the state? You can notify the state unemployment agency when employees are recalled, whether they come back or not. And Virginia Employment Commission has actually set up a separate page on their website to allow employers to do that. So that's important for your unemployment to not take a greater hit, if any, than it has. I-9, so during this time frame, the I-9s did not need to be filled out face-to-face. Obviously, that would be difficult to do during the middle of a pandemic. But when your employees come back to the workplace, if someone was hired during this time frame, you're going to need to fill out that section of the I-9 form that wasn't traditionally completed, I'll say, that wasn't completed in the face-to-face. And you'll need to check, again, if someone has you'll want to update their I-9 if they had any work authorization documents that expired during this time frame, or if there's any other changes that need to be made. And sometimes you may even need to complete a new I-9 if they're providing different documents than what they did if it was completed remotely during the pandemic. So all of that, as well as compensation, we recommend putting that in writing when you're telling people it's time to come back to the workplace. Here's all the things we're doing to keep you safe. Here's the date we'd like you to return. Here's what your schedule is going to be, pay rate, benefits, any other changes that they need to be informed of. Do it in writing so that if they, again, refuse to return to work, or if they're going to request an accommodation because they don't feel comfortable returning to work, perhaps they have an underlying health condition, perhaps someone in their family does, perhaps they have older family members that are living with them, that at least opens the door to that conversation. So the next slide is talking about FFCRA compliance. This is something that passed, I think it was March 18th, and went into effect, but a lot of employers are not familiar with it if they shut down on March 15th. If they had to close their door back in March, this hasn't been an issue. It's still in effect, and it provides for emergency paid sick leave requests for employees for certain circumstances, and it also requires employers to provide paid family leave if an employee's child's place of care, either their school or their child care center or whoever normally provides care to them, is unavailable because of COVID. So the emergency paid sick leave is basically for certain circumstances, if the person themselves has symptoms of COVID, if one of their family members may have COVID and they're caring for them, if their child. So it's certain situations you have to provide them with 80 hours of paid sick leave. And then the emergency paid family leave is for up to 12 weeks, but that is only at 2/3 of the employee's regular pay. Whereas the emergency paid sick leave, if it's for the person's own diagnosis or quarantine time period, that would be at their full pay. So now that you're open, if you have been closed, you're going to want to make sure you're familiar with those requirements. If you've been open all along, I'm sure you're well aware of FFCRA and should have a policy in place for employees to request that type of leave if those circumstances come up. So the probably most important thing you can do is to have a plan. And then the second most important thing you can do is to consider, what if this plan doesn't go according to plan? What if an employee refuses to return to work? What if an employee requests additional time off after they've already exhausted their FFCRA? What if an employee thinks they were exposed, whether that's in your office space or whether that's elsewhere? What are you going to tell other employees if someone's suddenly out and rumors going around that they have COVID? How are you going to handle that? And then if an employee does test positive, what are the steps you're going to follow, whether that's the employee or the family member? So it's really important to have a plan for all these potential situations that we hope won't occur. But if it does occur, you want to be prepared for it. If an employee refuses to return to work, it's going to be important to understand why. Again, if it's because they're concerned about a family member with an underlying health condition, you are actually required to explore possible accommodations in that situation. Can they continue to telework, or are there other adjustments that can be made to allow them to work? Maybe in a different, maybe they're working evenings, whereas everyone else is working days. Just try and explore those accommodations with them. But if it is due to those increased unemployment benefits, you can advise that employee that all return to work offers are being reported to the state and that their refusal to return may impact their unemployment eligibility. You don't want to get ugly about it, but that's the facts. I mean, if they have a job, they should be returning to that job, not continuing to take unemployment. So a lot of things that you'll have to, it's going to be different for every workplace. What things will occur, how you're going to respond to them, but you don't want it the first time you're thinking about it to be when the employee calls you and says, my wife just tested positive for COVID, what do I do? You want to have a plan in place ahead of time. And there is a lot of good guidance on the CDC website that gives you information about how to handle that. So I know we're going to have a Q&A session at the end, so I will leave it there, and I think I'm turning it over to Jay.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Thanks, Jennifer. Sorry, I was having some issues getting my mic undone. So, kind of following these two ladies and the great info that they gave, most of the stuff that I will give will kind of dovetail in, I hope, nicely. And I wanted to start off as we're all getting ready to gear back up, and my wife shared with me a screenshot, I think this was last week, a couple days ago, from the New York Times COVID tracker, and Charlottesville popped up as the new high is only a few days or weeks away. It just serves as a reminder, as we're doing all this, we do need to kind of maintain focus of kind of what's going around, and it's an increasing rather than decreasing here. So that just adds a little bit, a little more seriousness, I guess, to all of what we're going over. The next slide really, in the property casualty, which is where I kind of reside, that world, the questions that we're most fielding, here's this list. Some of this stuff I will talk about really isn't reopening stuff, so I'll touch on it here. The stuff more with reopening, I'm going to go into a little bit of a deeper dive as we progress. So business income is one that we feel a lot of questions, especially earlier in March, which is we could cover covered loss, keeping, normal operating expenses, payroll, rents, those type of things. But it is a property coverage, and so that's where some of those issues, I'm sure if anyone's had questions, you've already kind of gone over those things. Workers' compensation, we'll talk in a little bit more detail soon. The event cancellation, also, we have gotten some questions about that, and it can depend on the policy, especially just kind of one-off policies. There were endorsements that could cover some, and then you've probably heard some of the larger, like conventions or Wimbledon, had some event contingency with pandemic coverage. But I can tell you from looking in the beginning in December, actually, that's when they stopped offering that. So anything new from December 2019 on does not have that coverage going forward. And obviously reopening liability concerns, I'll touch about in a little bit. Some areas that we don't get a lot of questions on, but I think you should be contemplating. Cyber liability, which is also going to include most of the remote working and maybe some sort of paying your bills more remotely, those type of stuff, again, has been mostly addressed by now. But employment practices liability, something that will fall in the line with a lot of what was already been discussed, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. And the D&O liability, the decisions, management liability, what you're kind of putting in place, what you're promising. We have seen, and this doesn't really fall for the nonprofit world per se, but there have been some claims already on the books, more for for-profit companies discussing either their finances or how they're in place to, for demand, kind of false hopes of what they can or can't do. So if I'm in the nonprofit world and I haven't taken my services, I think you really want to make sure that you understand your capabilities and capacity if that is something you're going to be talking about. So the next slide goes to the biggest question that we get, obviously, is there coverage for a COVID-19 loss? And that is a very, very gray area. And I'm going to start with most carriers will state that their intention is not to cover pandemic losses, this type of loss. And the simple reason really is just like a lot of large losses come to mind. Nuclear war is excluded. Flood loss, flood policies need to be put on the reason we have a federal flood program is most carriers can't really sustain the pricing for that. If they were to cover it properly, the premiums that everyone is paying would not make it a viable alternative. So that is kind of how the carriers would see this, and how they've tried. That's their intent. That being said, that most of the calls and whenever I talk to one of my clients, I make it very clear that I can read a policy and I can interpret it, and this is what I'm seeing, but I am not the final determining factor. I mean, carriers are, it's their responsibility to interpret their policies. And I guess down the line, courts obviously will have a final say as well. So if I'm encouraging people, if you have a claim with any of this, file, put the carrier on record, make them interpret it. It is it's up to them. I feel like my clients, when we do that, we file promptly. We get that. We don't sugarcoat. We can say this is how we're reading it, and so I think you go into the claim process eyes wide open. But I think that's what I've been encouraging people to do. The next slide goes more to the workers' compensation. What happens if my employee comes back to work and feels that they've gotten a positive now because through work? And all of this is subject to change. Everything, it's evolving daily. Courts have not, there haven't been real, we don't have any, any decisions yet on a lot of this stuff. So please take any of this with a grain of salt, because we're kind of learning it on the fly. But workers' compensation is designed to cover work-related injuries. And so as I understand it, the biggest kind of thing to establish is how, if that person did become positive at work. Certainly much easier, as I said in the slide, is showing the slides, an emergency room nurse, that's going to be much easier to kind of substantiate than maybe me, right? Or, someone working remotely, that type of thing. But again, file. If someone is reporting that, we file it, we let it go to the system. I would anticipate with a lot of this stuff, there's going to be a little bit of a backlog. I think workers' compensation claims are going to take a little bit longer. Medical offices are closed. There's more telemedicine, yes, but even if things go to the Workers' Compensation Commission, there's a backlog because the offices have been closed. So just know that. And then the other question is, if you are of the size and scope that have that experience mod, there's always concern with claims extending, obviously. And just know that NCCI has been really trying to push for legislation through states to make COVID-19 losses not count against your experience modification factor. So that's something just to keep up on. The next slide is really just a reopening flow chart. I'm not really going to touch base on this. It's from CDC information. Both Kathleen and Jennifer have already provided all this good information. It's just something that it's a good little, I thought was a good imagery to use. And again, it's all CDC information. The next slide, reopening and insurance carrier guidance. So basically what they just talked about, that's what the carriers would say what you want to do. You want to, they won't ever give you a blanket statement of this is covered, this isn't covered. They're going to always say it's going to be, and rightly so, any claim is going to be looked at a case-by-case basis. And so encourage your clients to follow all federal, local, specific agency laws, document that to the letter, right? And make sure that you have a record on it. That is really what you need to do for the insurance piece. And one thing I would add, that a lot of times when we're talking about, the coverage or non-coverage, at the end of the day, the best way is, prevention is always the best way to mitigate. And so following best practices, just because you have auto liability doesn't mean you don't screen your bus drivers for, their driving record before you let them, drive a bus, right? And it's the same here. Is your best options is to follow, the OSHA guidelines, the CDC guidelines, that type of thing. The next slide also, it does go to the employment practices liability. What we anticipate, we're going to, wage and hour claims, which it's hard to track hours remotely, right? So we anticipate some of that. Discrimination, an employee can challenge why they were selected to be laid off or furloughed. So again, documentation, having all that in place. Wrongful termination, I think the one that pops up right on the nurse early on who was claiming she was fired because there wasn't enough PPE, she refused to go in, and she was terminated, claims like that, making sure that if there is a termination, even in this, it's going to be have that documentation. And retaliation claims also kind of tie into, hey, I didn't feel safe going into this environment, so I refused to go, and then they retaliated against me. So document, anticipate this, and always remember too, even if someone puts a suit, doesn't necessarily mean you did it, but we do want to try and defend it. And these are some of the things to be thinking about. Then my next slide really has already been talked about. So when I made this, I didn't realize that, but really it's following the plans and the considerations that Jennifer discussed, that Kathleen discussed, and really have a plan and think and document. So the next, other proactive steps. Let your agent know if your operations have changed at all. You know, the best, I think the most common example, it doesn't again apply to the nonprofit, but you know, restaurants now who've never had delivery services are now having some delivery service. That is something they should discuss with their insurance agent, just to make sure that, you know, carriers are working, they understand that things have changed, and a lot of carriers have been doing some good things. But you know, I don't know unless you tell me that you're doing this X, Y, and not Z now. So can't hurt to run it by. I would review the vacancy coverage, the provision in your property policy. With everybody being remote, that, you know, a vacancy clause changes what's covered and what's not, and it would be good to know. Most, again, we have a lot of carriers who are working with us or thinking about that, but it's always good to know that going now, so we can advocate for you, or we can discuss how to best prepare for that. You know, reviewing your IT procedures and your infrastructure, especially if you're going to continue to have remote workers. And then the last one, prepare to review your renewal policies. I suspect we're going to see some policy language changes. It's going to happen. And certainly my clients expect me to review the policy for renewals and compare, and we do that. I also encourage you to. We all can make mistakes or not catch up anything. If you got two eyes, you know, measuring twice and cutting once, I think we don't know what is going to come down the pike, and just, it can't hurt to check. I expect we're going to see some policy language. I guess the one last other thing, a proactive step, if you do have a lot of auto exposure, there are some carriers who will continue to provide some layup credit, where if you're taking vehicles off the road, as long as you're maybe taking off the license plates, making sure they're not driving, they will give you some discounts. And then lastly, some resources you may not have considered. First and foremost, with the D&O or the employment practices, many carriers that, you know, I represent and have policies, they have an 800 number for some free legal advice, or to run something by for the D&O and the employment practices. They do that to keep their costs down, I guess, if you want to be cynical, but it's a good resource, and it's something that it's there. It could be built into your policy, so it's something to think about. The Independent Insurance Agent of Virginia website has some very good COVID-19 resources, as opposed to just the CDC and all that. It's also sometimes interesting to see, it is also a lobbying group, insurance lobbying group, just to get a different perspective or get that kind of perspective, but they do have some good information there as well. And then the last one, again, I'm not an attorney either, but I can get down the rabbit hole of Stanford Law School has this great memo database from large law firms about some COVID-19 and issues, including liability issues and all that stuff. And it can be an interesting resource to look at. And that is all for me.
Thanks, Jay, and thanks everybody else. I had a couple questions come up along the way that I'll get started with, and if folks have other questions, now would be a great time to throw those up into the chat, and we'll work our way through what comes up. One thing that came up was a question around whether or not masks are mandatory, and so I just wanted to make sure it's clear to everybody that at the end of last week, the governor put out an executive order in the state of Virginia saying, and it says a lot of things, but basically what it says is that if you're in any kind of a business, any kind of a building that has people gathering, if you're over 10 years old, you should be wearing a mask. And so that's going to apply to all of our organizations. The question came up around that, and again, not a lawyer, about whether or not it's appropriate to deny entry then to folks, which to me would seem to be the case. And then the second question, whether or not it's mandatory or what it might mean to be supplying folks with masks as they come in. And I can see that being maybe any three of you have some perspective on what might be a best practice around that.
Yeah, so as far as providing masks to your employees, if you are requiring people to wear masks under OSHA guidelines, you have to provide them with the PPE that's required for them to do their job. So I would say, yes, you can certainly say if they wish to provide their own, that's fine. You should be aware, those N95 masks that unless you're a healthcare provider, you really shouldn't be wearing anyway. But those actually would trigger under OSHA guidance the need to have a respiratory protection program, which we don't need to get into what that involves, but it does involve fit testing and training and having a written program. So if one of your employees has one of those, I would actually encourage you to explain to them that you're not permitted to wear that in the workplace, and here's why: because we don't have these procedures in place. We can't fit test you, we can't train you, so we can't allow you to wear that type of mask. But you can certainly, if people prefer to bring their own, they can bring them voluntarily. But if they say, I don't have a mask, then you would be required to provide it.
Yeah, and I think it's a good practice to have just, paper masks on hand. They're now more available than they were certainly in the beginning of the pandemic. Paper masks on hand for either staff or clients or anybody who might visit your workplace, because I think people are pretty good about keeping their mask in their pocket or what have you, but they forget them. They left it the last place they were at. They just things happen in the routine carrying out of your business in the day. And I think having the mask available, and if somebody doesn't have one on and is trying to come in, having the conversation about why it's important to keep them and other people safe might be a good kind of a teaching moment.
There's a related question just popped up, whether or not if I'm in the office and I'm in my own space and I close the door, is it okay for me to take my mask off then? Any thoughts?
Yeah, I think you should have that policy. When do people, and I think I referenced that's the kind of guidance you want to provide as an employer, that if you're in your own space, your door is closed, no one else is in there, you don't have to wear the mask. But if you're in public areas, if you're in the hallways, if you're in the restroom, the kitchen, if you're in a place where anyone else is or could be at any time, that's when you need to be wearing that mask. And I don't know that we addressed the question about if someone wants to come into your place and refuses to wear a mask. And unfortunately, 3 weeks ago, we've seen some violence around that, which is just horrible. But it's important that if you have that situation to occur, you're going to want to have at least a couple of your employees who are trained on how to handle that situation. And if necessary, you may need to call the police if that comes to that. But you don't want someone who doesn't have de-escalation type training trying to engage in that type of a situation, because it can result in escalation and potentially violence in your workplace.
And on that point, it should be noted that it's not a misdemeanor to not wear a mask. So you can't get arrested. So if someone's just walking in to your organization, don't call the don't call the police on them. But some kind of de-escalation first, and then if violence ensues, then maybe the police are an option at that point.
Right. Yeah. Thank you for clarifying. That's not the first. Isn't to call 911 because someone walks in without wearing a mask. Try and explain to them the reason that it's important and that it's your policy in your organization and required, and see if obviously they're willing to do so or leave.
Was
there something you wanted to add to that, Kathleen?
No, I would agree with that. And just again, I think there are a small minority of people who don't want to wear a mask for some kind of political statement, and that's okay. Then they just can't enter your workplace. They can't enter your organization. That's a choice they make. I certainly wouldn't get into the argument on the politics of it, but I would, I think, engage on the infection control and the safety of it.
And is there any kind of liability about supplying? If I come to your office and I don't have a mask and you give me a mask, is there a liability issue I need to be concerned about, that the mask I gave somebody is like not a good mask or not the right kind of mask?
Not that I'm aware of. No, I think if you supply one in good faith, I think you're fine.
Thanks. And again, a similar question sort of popped up around covering fabric furniture, and I'm just wondering. So I think the question here is there were some guidelines around covering fabric furniture with plastic to make it easier to clean. Does that seem reasonable? Does it seem like a good idea?
Makes me think about my grandmother's house, but that's neither here nor there. I think it certainly would be easier to clean, but again, I think the recent information about this being transmissible from surface to surface was very kind of reassuring. So I think, work with your cleaners and have them vacuum the fabric furniture each day, and I think, you'd be fine. They could spray some disinfectant on it and leave it overnight, what have you. I don't think that that's going to be a huge issue for folks.
Thanks. And then there was a question around FFCRA, or what I took to be a question on there. And so I think two pieces to this. One is that the question was, is the sick leave in addition to the other time that got mentioned? And then the second half was, is that sort of special COVID time supposed to be available before other earned leave time?
So the FFCRA is in addition to if the company or the agency already provides PTO. It's in addition to any existing PTO or sick leave that is provided by the employer. That it can only be used for the COVID-related reasons, for the reasons that are outlined in the FFCRA. So if someone were to use the time, then again, if it's for the person's own potential illness, isolation, self-quarantine, then that is paid at 100%. If it's paid at 2/3 because you're taking care of your child who may have COVID or is self-quarantining or whose school has closed or place of care is closed, that's paid at 2/3, and the employee can voluntarily supplement that with their PTO if they choose to do so, but they cannot be required to do so. Does that answer the question?
That was clear to me. So if there's just someone else who has a further question, please throw it up in the chat around that. And then another question I had was an interesting one. So I think we at some point at least we covered if I ask employees to come back to work and they say no, they're obligated to do that, and if they refuse, that's sort of their prerogative. But one of the questions was around particularly high-risk staff, so older populations, folks with underlying conditions who are really pushing to get back into the workplace. So maybe not as much a legal question, but maybe more of a communication and relationship question there about how best to handle that kind of situation.
So let me make sure I understand the question. If it's an employer or volunteer who's in a high-risk category that wants to return, okay. So while you can certainly ask people, which normally you wouldn't, but because it is a pandemic and there's exceptions being made to EEOC regulations, you can ask people about, do you have concern about this? Do you have concern about older people in your home or underlying health conditions? And again, normally you wouldn't do that. But the EEOC has loosened that up so that we can be aware and protect people. But you can't say, no, you can't come back because you have that condition. The idea is you're providing a safe workplace to everyone. If they feel uncomfortable because of their own condition, you certainly will want to have the conversation. Is there anything we can do to accommodate you? And then whether or not they would continue to be eligible for unemployment would be something the state would determine. The EC would determine that, not you. But you would report that the return to work offer was made, and then they would explain the reasons why they didn't want to go back. But if they are wanting to return to the workplace, then you again, you want to have your procedures in place to keep them safe, and you want to allow them to return to work. You should not treat people in these categories against their will differently than you are treating others in the workplace.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, is there an analogy there between accessibility? Does that make sense?
Yeah, so you're saying, I mean, you want to, I'm not sure I would make quite that parallel, but it is similar in that you always want to explore people's willingness to return to the workplace and create comfort for them and be flexible. I mean, that's going to be the key for everything. We're going to have to learn as we go along, and everyone's going to be flexible and be compassionate with each other. But, again, to say you wouldn't allow an older person to return to the workplace or someone with an underlying health condition, whereas you would allow someone that has a lower risk. And again, assuming it's against their will, that's not something that you'd want to do. You'd want to allow them to return because, again, the idea is you put those safety procedures in place so that they can be safe. But if they feel uncomfortable and they have some of those underlying conditions, you'd certainly want to be compassionate and flexible and try and accommodate them to the greatest extent possible.
Thanks.
Sure.
Did either of you want to jump in there on any of those topics?
Oh, I think Jennifer covered it. That sounded great.
There's another question here about the tracking. So tracking symptoms, and so I think if I understand the question, it's saying there's sort of a privacy issue about whether I'm collecting this information or not. We have this option of providing self-tracking forms so people can track their symptoms, track their own temperatures. But what kind of oversight can I put in place to make sure that's getting done, that it's getting done, properly and accurately, and that it's being that information is actually useful to and being followed. Do you have some thoughts?
Yeah, I can speak to that unless someone else wants to. With the self-screening, or I'll give my take on it. The self-screening forms, you can have them submitted. Again, I'd recommend electronically. I'd recommend securely. I'd recommend to somebody who is an HR professional or someone who is comfortable dealing with confidential information, because it is medical information once that log is completed. So if you want to have them submitted daily, weekly, monthly, with whatever frequency your organization wishes to review that information, you can certainly do that. You just, once the information is shared with you, the employer, it now needs to be maintained in a confidential fashion. Same goes for if someone does have symptoms of COVID and is working remotely or not working. Again, there's the guidance from the CDC and the Virginia Department of Health on how to handle that situation. But the bottom line is you have the person stay out of the workplace. You ask them, who have they been in close contact with? And that is generally defined as, being within 6 feet of somebody for an extended time period, whether that's 30 minutes or more, 3 hours or more. But you find out who they've been in close contact with, and then you tell those individuals that, I mean, generally, again, it varies a little bit depending on the environment, healthcare being different, but that those folks would then self-quarantine and may seek diagnosis or may not, just depending on the availability, but they should contact their healthcare provider and self-monitor. The other folks within the workplace should be told that, and in all cases, it should just be told that someone has tested positive or someone is experiencing symptoms, not who the person was. That should always be maintained confidentially unless the person, him or herself, says, I'm comfortable with everyone knowing that it's me, and you should probably get that in writing from the individual. But generally that's going to be confidential, and then the workplace will just be told that someone is experiencing symptoms, that person is self-quarantining, those that work closely with that person are also self-quarantining, so therefore they can interpret, I haven't been in close contact with that person because I'm not at home self-quarantining. And then you want to be flexible. If other people say, I just don't feel like I can come back to work right now until I know whether or not this person was positive, you want to try and be flexible with that and understand that this is a scary time and be compassionate.
I would just add that the health department, for those people who do test positive, the health department contacts those folks and goes through their contacts with them and defines what close contact means. And I don't know if they're using a 15-minute standard or a 30-minute standard, but they have some standard now. And they do then the contact tracing on the contacts, which is then they contact those folks who've had close contact and ask them essentially to quarantine for 14 days. So from an employer standpoint, I think you want to have as little health information about your employees as possible because it is hard to keep it confidential. And know that if there is a positive case, then that might affect a good number of people in your organization. So you might have a staff of 30 today, and then suddenly, tomorrow and the next day, you might have 15 people off on quarantine for 2 weeks. So I think from an operations standpoint, you need to be thinking about how do we flex up and down quickly like that, because that could happen.
Yeah, absolutely true. And to your point, remote work isn't going to go away. I mean, that could be another situation where people are going back to working remotely. And you're exactly right about the health department. I'm not sure the capacity of the health department to be doing that contact tracing in a timely fashion, which is why in a lot of cases, the employer may need to take the initiative, at least for the workplace, to identify those close contacts.
And the one other thing that I would add is if you're an organization that is not used to handling confidential medical information or anything, especially over email, and you start doing that, make sure that you have the right IT procedures and protocols and security in place before you do. And so that's just something, if you're not used to doing it, you should be making sure you follow.
I don't know, I'd be curious about your thoughts on this, Jennifer, on the screening. I like the idea of kind of a screening with a questionnaire, but would an attestation that says, I don't have any of these above symptoms suffice?
Well, yeah, but I think the reason to kind of list out all of the symptoms as they're currently being identified, and it has been evolving over time, is just a reminder for people to actually check themselves about those. Now, that may be something you want to do with visitors to your workplace, because obviously you're not going to be having, well, I mean, you may be taking their temperatures. It definitely depends on what you establish as your procedures. But certainly I think that statement would be better than none. And I know some of the clients that we work with that are home health care providers are doing kind of mutual statements. The client or, the client and their family members are attesting to no symptoms. And then the care providers are also attesting to no symptoms. Yeah, that's a great suggestion as well.
On that confidentiality point, I think I have one more. Oh, no, there's a question about the log. How long should the employee's contact log be retained about hanging on to this information?
Yeah, again, I mean, this is all new and evolving, so it needs to be maintained confidentially. How long it should be maintained for, I would follow whatever your record retention procedures are for any medical information. So, and that's just going to vary depending on what your internal policies are, but it would fall under that medical information bucket.
And then I was wondering also about confidentiality and thinking about those underlying conditions, because that could be another place where maybe there's some conflict. If I tell my supervisor, oh, I'm diabetic, so take extra care around me, but I'm not comfortable letting everybody in the organization know I'm diabetic. Do you have any sort of, maybe that's too hypothetical, but does that resonate with you, that kind of situation?
Sure,
I think
absolutely.
that's a really good, yeah, I think that's a good example, or people who are HIV positive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You know, I don't think that the employee has a duty to inform their employer of what their condition is, or even if they have a condition. I think it's the employer's duty to inform the employees of, here are the parameters, and if you are an at-risk individual, here's what our policy and procedure is. So I don't think that employers want to get into the situation of actually asking for confidential information, because then you have the burden of it.
That's very true. Yep, absolutely. Yeah, so if you're doing a survey with your employees about returning to work and do you have concerns, rather than saying, and what are they?
Yeah, that's
you know,
uh-huh.
you can just say, do you have any concerns about underlying health conditions, and make it yes or no versus open-ended where they're telling
right. You don't even know what they are. Just if they are. So, and there was another question here about the clarifying about the employee signing off daily attesting that they don't have symptoms. That way that you don't have any health information about them. They don't have symptoms. If they do have symptoms, they can just say yes, and you don't have to know what that symptom is. So I would say, yeah, just the attestation, in my mind, better way to handle that in kind of a non-healthcare environment, obviously.
Sorry, my dog is barking, so I had my mic muted. There's a question here about asking, are you allowed to ask employees for a doctor's note? I'm guessing about whether or not they have an underlying condition or whether or not they're cleared and ready to come back for work and those sorts of things.
So I wouldn't ask for a doctor's note attesting to the underlying health condition. When employees are returning to work, again, it kind of depends a little bit on what your policy is, what information you're going to require. We're not recommending that employers require a note from a doctor saying that someone has tested negative in general. If it's a healthcare situation, that might be a different answer. But in general, you know, following the guidance that the Department of Health and the CDC has put out in terms of when someone can return to work, and you can require a healthcare provider to say that the person can return to work. Again, depending on, you know, I think it's a little different now than it was a couple months ago when the healthcare system was in such shock. But, you know, to the earlier discussion, cases are rising here in Virginia. So that requirement is a little bit dependent on the circumstances, I guess. It's been recommended not to always require documentation from a healthcare provider because of the shortage of ability for healthcare providers to see people, but instead just to follow the return to work procedures. There's a testing procedure and a non-testing procedure, and those are both outlined in CDC and in the Department of Health guidelines. So depending on which of those is being followed would say whether or not a test result would be required.
I think for reasons of missing work because of infection, so this would be sort of akin to TB or pink eye, or you know, there's a number that employers routinely screen for, and if you test positive, you usually do require some kind of clearance if that person is safe to return to the workplace. Risk to the other employees, not because of any risk to the person.
Thanks. And I just have one last question. With the shifts between remote work and and back in the office work with the changes around cleaning and things like that. And maybe you covered this earlier. I just wanted to check how pressing is it that all of the details around those kinds of changes get captured in people's job descriptions as you're going along?
So you're talking about if people are required to do cleaning and so forth.
Yeah, for example.
Gotcha. So I think it's always good to have up-to-date job descriptions, but it may be more practical to have a policy that you train everyone on around what are your procedures in terms of cleaning common areas, if that's going to be an expectation. And I think it also kind of depends on, you know, it's a little undetermined yet. Is this going to be forever? Is this going to be until there's a vaccine? Is it going to be until we've all determined that we've been infected and we have immunity? So I think if it was going to be forever or for the foreseeable future, it definitely would be something you'd want to bake into the job description. But for now, while we're hoping that this may still be temporary and this may not be something that they have to do forever, it may be more practical to simply have a procedure around the cleaning that everyone gets trained on and signs off on, that they signs off either virtually or electronically, not necessarily on the paper, that they understand that that's part of their job duties.
Great.
Kathleen, what are your thoughts on that?
I completely agree with that. Yeah, I think you've nailed that. Yep.
Well, thank you, all of you, so much for taking the time to share this information with us. Really appreciate that. I'll be sharing the slide deck with the participants, as well as a video copy of this, and making that available on our website as well, in case folks want to share that more broadly. And yeah, just thanks again, and really enjoy the rest of your day.